Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, today we got a really specific mission. Think of us as your expert study guides. We're going deep on some core questions about the early American colonies.
That's right. We've got, 9 key concepts pulled straight from the source material. And the idea is to really nail down the facts, sure, but also get into why they matter. The context. It's about understanding the bigger picture of colonization, not just memorizing names and dates.
Exactly. Making sense of it all. So let's unpack this. Let's start right at the beginning, maybe look at the Chesapeake colonies first. Labor, politics, the foundations.
Sounds good. And you really have to start with labor in Virginia. It was all about the economics, right? So first key term. What do you call those workers who basically sold their labor for, say, 4 or 5 years to get passage to the New World?
That term is absolutely crucial for understanding early Virginia. Those were indentured servants.
Precisely. Indentured servants. And it's important to remember, this wasn't quite slavery as we think of it later. It was a contract, an indenture, usually 5, maybe 7 years. These were often young, poor English folks.
Right. And in exchange for signing this contract, giving up their freedom for years, they got their passage paid, food, clothes, a place to sleep. But the conditions were brutal, weren't they?
Oh, incredibly brutal. The sources show between 1607 and 1622, something like 10,000 people arrived under this system. Fewer than 2,000 actually survived their term. It was harsh.
Wow. But if they survived, what then?
If they made it, they got what were called freedom dues. And sometimes that included land, which ties into another concept.
The headright system.
Exactly, the headright system. The promise of 50 acres of land. It was a massive incentive to get people over there, especially those who could pay for others, because they needed labor, tons of it, for one specific crop.
Tobacco. The thing John Rolfe introduced that finally made the colony profitable.
Yeah, tobacco was Virginia's gold. Hugely profitable, but incredibly labor-intensive, so that demand for indentured servants just kept growing. It shaped everything.
Okay, so Virginia's built on this tough, profit-driven labor system, which makes the next point kind of surprising, actually. That's about politics.
Right.
The very first governing body in the colonies, established way back in 1619 in Virginia. What was it called?
That would be the House of Burgesses.
The House of Burgesses. It sounds almost democratic. An elected assembly giving landowners a voice. How did that happen so early, in a place built on indentured labor?
Well, it was partly an incentive, to attract more settlers, especially those with a bit more substance, and keep them invested in the colony's success. They needed to offer some kind of local say-so. It was pretty radical for the time.
But there has to be a catch, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's always a catch with colonial power. While the Burgesses existed, the real authority, that stayed with the colonial governor, appointed by the king back in England.
And he could just veto anything.
Yep. He had the power to veto anything the assembly passed. So right from the start, you see this tension baked into American politics. This desire for local representative government bumping up against ultimate imperial control.
Fascinating. Virginia. Driven by tobacco, dependent on harsh labor. But with this early seed of self-governance, even if it was limited. Okay, let's shift gears completely. Northward to New England.
Right. A totally different vibe. If Virginia was about earthly profits, New England was much more focused on the heavens. Theology was the driving force, not tobacco.
And the key figure setting that tone was Governor John Winthrop. He famously described his Massachusetts Bay Colony with a powerful image. He called it a city upon a hill.
City upon a hill. That phrase really captures the Puritan ambition, doesn't it?
It really does. Winthrop wasn't just looking for a place to escape persecution.
Oh.
He genuinely envisioned Massachusetts Bay as like a model society, a new English Israel, he called it, a beacon of Reformed Protestantism for the whole world to see and hopefully emulate. And the people who came were different too, right? Not just young men seeking fortunes like early Jamestown.
No, exactly. These were often whole families migrating together, sometimes even from the same towns in England, like Somerset. They were deeply committed to building this religious community together, and that commitment showed up everywhere, especially in education.
Which brings us to another question. Let's say you're attending the very first university established in the New World, Harvard. What's your major likely to be?
Well, overwhelmingly, you'd be studying ministry, theology, or religion.
Makes sense.
Yeah, you hear about high literacy rates in New England. Maybe 60% could read when they arrived, which was amazing for the time. But it wasn't just literacy for its own sake. It was driven by the absolute need for everyone to be able to read and study the Bible for themselves. That was central to their faith. So education was essentially religious training.
Okay, so they're focused on God, highly literate. But what about the economy? New England soil wasn't great for cash crops like tobacco or rice. It was rocky, the climate harsher. How did they make things work, especially in their trade with Native Americans?
Yeah.
What was the name for those shells that formed an economic base?
Yes, that would be wampum.
Wampum. Just shells. Or was there more to it?
Oh, much more. Wampum beads weren't just currency, though they were used that way. They were also important for jewelry, for ceremonies, for diplomacy. It was a crucial medium for interacting and trading with the local Native American tribes. Since large-scale farming wasn't the main thing, New England's economy leaned more towards things like, timber, charcoal, fishing, and eventually shipbuilding became huge.
So a society built on religious purity and community. But that kind of intense focus often leads to intolerance of dissent, right? Which brings us to a famous figure who challenged the authorities, who was the rebellious female voice in the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
That has to be Anne Hutchinson, a really remarkable figure.
What exactly did she do that got her banished in 1638? It wasn't just holding meetings, was it?
No, I mean, holding religious meetings led by a woman was definitely not okay with Governor Winthrop and the ministers. But her real theological crime, the thing that truly threatened them, was her claim of direct revelation. She said God spoke directly to her.
Undercutting the authority of the ministers.
Exactly. And she pushed for what she called a covenant of grace, basically. Salvation through faith alone against their established covenant of works, which emphasized following strict moral laws and church rules. To them, this sounded like chaos, undermining the entire social and religious order they were trying to build.
And the establishment reacted harshly. Banished. She ended up in Rhode Island, then New Netherland.
Yeah, where she and most of her family were killed in an Algonquian raid. And Winthrop, chillingly, wrote that it was God's righteous judgment upon her. Shows you the dark side of that city upon a hill.
Okay, so we have these two very different colonial models, Virginia's economic engine and New England's religious experiment. Both developing distinct societies, but still under the English crown. Let's move into our third section, the imperial economy, social crises, and resistance.
Right, where Britain starts trying to maybe tighten the reins a bit.
Exactly. So, question 7. Starting around 1651, Britain passed a series of laws to control colonial trade and make sure the wealth flowed back to England. What were these acts called?
Those were the Navigation Acts.
The Navigation Acts.
Yeah.
And they were based on that economic theory, mercantilism.
Precisely, mercantilism. The core idea was that colonies exist to benefit the mother country. So the act said things like all trade had to be on English ships with English crews, and certain valuable goods, tobacco, sugar, rice, the enumerated articles, could only be shipped to England or other English colonies.
Sounds pretty strict on paper.
On paper, yes. But here's the crucial part. The historical reality. For a long, long time, maybe a century, enforcement of these acts was incredibly weak. It was inconsistent. Officials could be bribed. This whole period later got a name.
Salutary neglect.
Salutary neglect. Benign neglect, you could say, and the effect? While the colonists got really good at ignoring the rules. Smuggling became common. They basically learned how to manage their own economic affairs and, frankly, how to cheat the system.
So Britain unintentionally taught them economic independence and defiance just by not paying close enough attention.
You could definitely argue that. They got used to a certain level of freedom, economically speaking.
Okay, let's shift from economics to a major social crisis unique to that intense religious atmosphere of New England, the Salem witch trials. Question 8 is about the victims. Most of the people executed in the Salem trials belonged to what demographic group?
Sadly, but perhaps unsurprisingly given the time, the vast majority were women. 19 people were hanged in Salem in that single awful year of 1692.
It's such a famous, horrifying event. The sources suggest it wasn't just one thing that caused it, right? It only seemed to happen in places like Massachusetts Bay, not in more religiously laid-back Virginia.
Right. It seems to have been a kind of perfect storm of factors.
Yeah.
First, you absolutely have the underlying Puritan belief system, where the devil was very real, and women were often seen as, well, more susceptible to his influence. That's one layer.
And then external pressures.
Yes. Constant brutal warfare with Native Americans on the frontier created this pervasive sense of anxiety, fear, and crisis. People were on edge. And then you add internal social stresses.
Like tensions within the community itself.
Exactly. Historians point to friction between the more established, often more prosperous people in Salem town, who tended to be the accusers, and the folks living out in Salem Village, the more rural farmers, who were often the accused. It became a way to settle old scores, perhaps.
A tragic convergence of fear, belief, and social tension. But it's important to add, the community did eventually recognize its error, didn't it?
It did. Years later, there were formal apologies, attempts at restitution for the families of the victims, a sense that they had profoundly lost their way during that period of hysteria.
Okay, final question. This one brings us back south and deals with the brutal reality of slavery and how another European power tried to use it against the English. Question 9. Which country, controlling Florida, offered freedom to enslave people from the English colonies if they could escape?
That offer came from Spain. St. Augustine, Florida, was Spanish territory.
And this wasn't just humanitarianism, was it?
Oh, definitely not. It was pure geopolitics.
Yeah.
Spain wanted to destabilize the English colonies, especially wealthy South Carolina, by draining away their enslaved labor force. It was also a way to potentially gain soldiers. This promise of freedom hanging just over the border had a massive impact.
It was the spark for the largest slave uprising in the mainland colonies, right?
Absolutely. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, 1739. South Carolina had the highest proportion of enslaved people, maybe 65% of the population. The rebels were trying to reach Florida.
And the outcome.
The rebellion was crushed violently, and the response from the white colonists was predictable: fear and a massive tightening of control. South Carolina enacted even harsher slave codes, restricted movement, assembly, even learning to read. They even hired Native American scouts to hunt down escapees and gruesomely displayed their heads on pikes as a warning. It reinforced the brutality of the system.
So we've hit all 9 points: indentured servants, House of Burgesses, City upon a Hill, Ministry at Harvard, wampum, Anne Hutchinson, Navigation Acts, Salem Witches, and the Spanish offer leading to Stono. Quite a tour.
It really covers the spectrum, doesn't it? From the raw economics driving Virginia to the intense religious vision of New England and the imperial structures trying, often failing, to contain it all.
If you had to boil it down, what's the single most important takeaway from covering these specific points?
I think it's the sheer contrast between the foundational purposes of Virginia and New England: money versus God, roughly speaking. But crucially, both regions, in their own ways, developed strong traditions of local control. Virginia with its burgesses, New England with its town meetings and intense community focus, they got used to running their own affairs, even under the crown.
And that really sets the stage, doesn't it? That leads us to the final thought, the question hanging in the air as we move towards the mid-18th century.
Exactly.
Americans got used to local power, they got used to salutary neglect and finding ways around imperial rules. So what happens next? What happens when you get a new king, George III, and a British government that decides, okay, playtime's over, time to actually enforce those navigation acts, time to pay for colonial defense, time to assert control over those local assemblies?
What happens when you try to tighten the screws on a population that, by 1750 or 1760, already believes pretty strongly that its freedoms and its right to local self-government are basically settled facts?
That right there is the road to revolution, built on a century of experience.